Everything you thought you knew about what makes a marriage great is absolutely wrong. Today, couples therapist for the last 30 years, Dr. Bruce Chalmer, is going to talk about how what we think is great for a marriage, communication, is actually not really the problem with marriages that go sideways. He's going to talk about how we think that we really want stability in a relationship, and yet stability is the enemy of intimacy and passion and sexual drive and a really great on-fire relationship. And here's the wildest part. Dr. Bruce is going to tell us how infidelity, that being cheated on, could actually be one of the best things that ever happens to your relationship. So, if you're ready for a conversation that's raw, that's real, and that's going to elevate your intimate relationships to the next level to create happiness within your marriage, this is the episode for you. And if you love to feel happy every single week, be sure you hit that subscribe button. Welcome to the Good Mood Revolution. How could we possibly have a happier marriage after betrayal? Today, we're talking with Dr. Bruce Chalmer, psychologist and couples therapist who has helped couples find happiness after the hardest thing ever in their relationship for over 30 years. Dr. Bruce, what's happening? Welcome to Good Mood Revolution.
Well, thank you, Matt. I'm delighted to be here.
So I just want to get right to it. You get the gut punch. Mm-hmm. Your spouse cheats on you. Why do you believe that betrayal can sometimes save a relationship instead of destroying it?
Yeah, I mean, well, great question. Why do I believe it? Because I've seen it. Now, I don't want to be unrealistic. It doesn't always happen that the relationship stays together. But I've seen so many situations where, first of all, the relationship does stay together and is better than it ever was. And I've seen relationships break up in ways that nevertheless both parties feel better in a variety of ways. And, it's like, particularly like if they are parents of the same kids and they're still going to have a relationship. And I've seen those people heal as well. I've also seen people not, but it can be the gateway to a better relationship than you ever had, because what often happens when there's some kind of betrayal is it forces a couple to deal with stuff that they hadn't dealt with. And when they do that, they tend to be better off if they're able to get through it without totally freaking out.
Early in my relationship with my wife, she said, if you ever cheat on me, I won't stay with you. Mm-hmm. And I didn't say the same thing back because I just didn't know if I could believe that would be the case. And, thankfully we haven't cheated on each other. It's been we met in 2009, so it's been 16 years, and it's a wonderful marriage. The thought would be, if I did that to her, would she ever be able to forgive me? And I know one of the things you say is that sometimes forgiveness isn't the goal, and maybe it's not even possible.
Well, yeah, it depends on how you use the word forgive. So I like to think, in a certain sense, forgiveness is the goal, but not necessarily reconciliation. Those are two very different things. So I just want to address a couple of things. What your wife has said, I haven't counted, but dozens of people have been in my office saying some words to the effect that if you had asked me 6 months ago if my spouse cheated, would I stay in the relationship? I would have said exactly what your wife said. I would have said no. And there they are sitting there saying, but I want to save the relationship if it's possible. I want to find a way to get through this. So, and, with respect to your wife, of course, I believe that's how she feels. You just never know. And I hope it never happens. Don't cheat on her, for crying out loud, as you have noted.
I will not.
Good. I haven't cheated either, and I have no plans on it. But, it's just interesting that until it happens, people really don't know how they're going to feel. And that's true about pretty much anything. Until you actually experience it, you really don't know what it's going to be like. So that phenomenon, is it possible for people to forgive? Well, yeah, oddly enough. Forgiveness, there's basically two ways people use the word forgiveness. And there's the way I like and the way I don't. And, lots of people use forgive to mean basically the same as reconciliation. If I forgive someone who hurt me, that means I've restored the relationship. All right, we're back where we started. Water under the bridge, whatever cliche you want to use there. And that means, okay, we're fine. I can trust you again. I'm certainly not going to forget about it. The notion of forgive and forget is utter nonsense. If something's really hurt you, you better not forget it. That's our brains are designed to not forget things like that. But that phenomenon, that use of forgiveness is a way that people often use it. There's another way that a lot of people also use forgive, which is the way I much prefer. And that is to forgive. And this is, I think, comes out of 12-step programs. They use this expression, I believe. Forgiveness is an inside job. In other words, I can forgive someone who I don't trust at all. I can forgive someone that I have no intention of staying in relationship with. One of my favorite stories, I think I mentioned it in my most recent book. One of my favorite stories is about a woman I worked with, 15, 20 years ago, who she was seeing me. She was having some issues with her kids or whatever. Her ex-husband was in prison. The reason he was in prison is that he had been horrendously violent to both her and the kids. She'd managed to more or less get out with her life. I mean, it was really, it took an amazing amount of courage for her to get out of that relationship. And she forgave him. And she absolutely did not trust him. There was no way she wanted anything to do with him. She was able to not be angry anymore. She just figured, well, she understood it that he was basically nuts. He was crazy. And, it's almost like, well, yeah, not his fault that he's crazy, but you can't be around him.
My favorite quote on forgiveness, it's when one forgives, two souls are set free.
Oh, that's even better. I like that. Yeah, that's not the one I was thinking. I have a favorite quote about forgiveness as well. But yeah, when one forgives, two souls are set free. That's beautiful.
Because until we forgive, we're in bondage.
Yes.
I'm in bondage to the resentment I'm holding on to.
Yes.
And of course, our brain wants to hold on to this resentment because we've been hurt so bad and we don't ever want to get hurt again. So we're thinking, I'll just hold on to the resentment and not forgive so that I don't get back into that relationship and get back into that pain. I would imagine this woman that was being beat by her husband and her children were being beat by this man was thinking, I can't forgive because if I did, I might go back and then it would be just terrible again.
And I point that out actually in my book about this. Those are exactly the circumstances where you shouldn't forgive, at least not yet. Mm-hmm. If you're not safe, absolutely, as you're saying, that tendency to remain angry, to remain, sort of obsessed with it is a protection mechanism. If you're still in danger, yeah, that's not the time to say, oh, well, I can let go of it.
Yeah. And we'll see this because obviously she did love him or else she wouldn't have married him. And we'll see. And you wonder, why would somebody who's being hit go back to the person that's hitting them and trust that they're going to, when they bring flowers and they say it's the last time, why would they trust it's the last time? Well, it's because they want to trust it's the last time. It takes so much courage to completely, change your life and leave. And usually in these situations, they say, if you leave, I'll track you down and I'll hurt you and it'll be even worse. Yeah. And so then you start to have danger that leaving would be even worse. So yeah, I agree with you. The resentment needs to get so strong. The anger needs to get so strong. You're finally like, I've had enough. I don't care what the consequences are. I have to change. Mm-hmm. But then when she did get to safety, there's this thought, I'll hold on to the resentment because that resentment will keep me safe from getting back in that position. But it's just not the case.
Yeah. Well,
at that point, we've learned that this is a dangerous situation and I don't want to date someone else that's going to act like this again. Mm-hmm. We don't, just because we forgive, it doesn't mean we become stupid.
Well, that's almost verbatim out of my book. As a matter of fact, I point that out. Yes, forgiveness doesn't make you stupid. In fact, in some ways, it makes you smarter because you're not so, you have your whole brain to work with when you're not freaking out. So, that phenomenon that when you've forgiven, I'll give you my favorite Anne Lamott quote. So many people quote her. She's a novelist, but she's written a lot about this kind of thing. And I'm sure I'm paraphrasing slightly, but she says essentially, to not forgive is like drinking a rat poison and waiting for the rat to die.
Yeah.
And it is indeed, as you said, it's a burden on the person who hasn't forgiven. So in that sense, I do think healing ultimately does require a kind of forgiveness. It doesn't require that you become stupid. It doesn't require that you lose your judgment. It's so interesting, that phenomenon of people going back to abusive relationships. It's often all the things you were saying. It's often like incredibly difficult to do. It's often, it would mean, for some people, it would mean going into abject poverty or just being really physically unsafe. And for other people, there's also the sense that they do love the person and they think they can save them.
Yeah.
And, that's often what the person is more or less telling them. And so it's amazing how so many very intelligent and very strong people can get stuck in that sort of thing.
One of the most fascinating things was your last book. And you said everything you know about couples therapy is wrong.
That was actually my second book of 3. My most recent one was the one about betrayal and forgiveness. But yes, actually, I have a prop. I can hold up the book here. Yes, it's not about communication. Why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong. Is that a snarky title or what?
It is. And we always say, and my wife and I say this too, we think the reason our relationship is so strong is that we have amazing communication.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
And the idea is that if the relationship isn't strong, it's a lack of communication. So what do you mean that it's not about communication?
And what you just said sort of is a great entry into that concept. Well, why am I claiming it's not about communication? Because what you just said was, you have a great marriage, and that means you and your wife communicate well. If you weren't communicating well, you wouldn't have a great marriage. That's certainly true. The problem you get into, especially in couples therapy situations, is people come in and it's a substantial majority of the folks I see in the first session are saying, we need to communicate better. That's why they're there. Even if there's been a betrayal, that's also like half the folks I see. There's been some kind of major betrayal, like cheating or something. But they're often saying, well, we need to communicate. Every time we try to communicate, it goes off the rails. We get into a big fight, or it goes into a deep freeze, or some combination thereof, all of that stuff. So of course it's not ridiculous to say it's about communication. I mean, I'm silly to say it's not. But here's the sense in which I'm saying, no, actually it isn't. The folks who come in saying we need to communicate better are saying that because they observe, like your marriage, people in good marriages are communicating well. So therefore, they leap to the conclusion, not only they, but lots and lots and lots of therapists and people who write self-help books, and I'm in both of those categories, aren't I? Lots of people like that say, well, so we'll teach you how to communicate the way well-functioning couples communicate, and then you'll be a well-functioning couple. Baloney. That turns out not to be true. That is a fallacy. If you get to know me, you'll know I'm a recovering nerd with frequent relapses. So here's one of my nerdy moments. I love to quote the Latin for that fallacy. It is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which means, I never studied Latin, but apparently what that means is it's the after, therefore, because of fallacy. My favorite. So
it's like a correlation, not causation.
Yes, exactly. It is correlation, not causation. If you look at, Rafael Nadal, the tennis player, when he's hitting a point, well, I guess he's retired now, but he will go, this big grunt, as so many of them do. So I guess if I want to be like a professional tennis player, I just have to learn how to grunt better, and then I'll be a better professional tennis player. No, right. Turns out that's not true. The grunting probably, I don't know about tennis, but seems to be the grunting probably is correlated with their being good, but they're not good because they're grunting. They're grunting because they're good. You're communicating well with your wife because you guys get along well, because you love each other, you respect each other, you honor each other, all of those good things. And teaching couples to communicate, to sound like couples who are functioning well, will not make them function well. If you focus on, because really what it turns out, the vast majority, not all, not 100%, but the vast majority of couples I work with are actually experts at communication. The problem isn't that they don't know how to communicate. They are very clearly and accurately communicating. The problem is what they're communicating. If what they're communicating is mistrust, anger, contempt, disrespect, that's going to come through very clearly. If what they're communicating is the positive opposites of all those things, that's going to come through too. What you and your wife are communicating to each other is that you love and honor and respect each other.
Right.
And
so it's the underlying feeling.
Yes, exactly. And then even when you disagree, that's still there. That's
the respect, respect, the love, the honor is still there. The desire to see this person win and have a life of happiness is still there.
It's still there. And therefore, your communication reflects that. Now, there's the odd exception that I like to point out just to show that that's not a completely empty statement to say that most people are experts in communicating. There are the folks who aren't. Every once in a while, I'll meet a couple where one or both is somewhere on the autistic spectrum. That's an actual communication problem. If you, for example, what they used to call Asperger's, they've stopped using that word formally, but the tendency to not know how to read the person, read someone else's emotions. That's a communication problem. If you literally don't know if you're making your partner happy or pissing them off, that causes communications issues. They need to learn some skills. And occasionally I'll meet a couple where they literally do not speak the same language. If they're speaking some amount of English, if they're talking to me, because that's the only language I'm fluent in. I have smatterings of others, but when they're talking to me, at least one of them is fluent in English, but often maybe the other isn't. And that can lead to interesting communication problems too, but those are not the usual ones.
So my wife's family didn't talk about any issues growing up. And my mom talked about all of it. She was a hot mess after she left my dad, and we were her everything at that point. So she just would tell us everything that was going on. When she was crying after work about how hard it was, she would tell us what was going on and why she was crying. But my wife's family, they were the opposite. Mm-hmm. If something was going on and they weren't happy about it, they just wouldn't say anything. So that was a difference in communication styles with the two of us, where if she wasn't happy, she just would clam up. Mm-hmm. And it was very difficult for her to even say what she was upset about. And for me, I'd say every single thing that was on my mind, because that's the way that I was raised. And she'd be like, that's too much information.
Yep. Yeah. And
so how do you deal with couples who have completely different communication styles?
I think that's more the rule than the exception. Everybody's family is its own little mini culture. And so those differences you just described are, of course, very common. And how do you handle that? Well, if you are functioning well, and it's all about that other stuff, like about loving and honoring and, like you said, you want your wife to win and she wants you to win. It's like you both want to elevate each other. When you do that, you'll figure that stuff out without freaking out, because that overall sense of kinship will override the anxiety of the differences.
Well, say the person listening wants this relationship where they honor and love and respect and lift up the person they're with, and they feel like, I want that for them, but they don't want it back from them.
Yeah.
What would you say to that person? Or the person that says, I'm not in a great relationship because I can't find somebody good out there that wants me to have success the way I want them to have success.
Yeah, that, of course, is a very painful situation. Let's talk about the first of those first, which is, someone's in a relationship. They're feeling that for their partner. They're wanting it for their partner. They're not getting it back. And, what's my bias? I'm a couples therapist. It's like, well, that's stuff for couples therapy, ideally. And that's painful. It's difficult. I have a favorite, it's funny, that same book where I said it's not about communication, one of the chapters in there, I actually give the structure of my first session. My first session is the one that I structure pretty carefully. The rest of them are more like improv. It's basically a lot like improv. I discuss that in that book too. But that initial first session, I will talk to people about the need for both stability and intimacy, and, kind of give them a little rundown on how I think about that stuff. And then I will point out that, the chief skills of stability are all about avoiding anxiety. It's like, your wife's family's approach. The chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate the anxiety so that you can actually then hear each other. And it's tolerating the anxiety is the tricky part. So what that requires is that you not freak out. And, that gives rise. I don't have
because my wife loves to avoid conflict. So as she feels that there could be conflict, she'll just clam up about it.
Yeah.
Because she doesn't want the conflict.
She of course prizes stability, which is not a weird thing to prize. It's every bit as important as intimacy is. But what that gives rise to, actually, I usually have my cup handy, but I don't have that. I do have our tote bag handy from our This is our Couples Therapy in 7 Words is the name of the podcast that my wife, Judy Alexander, and I do. And that's the 7 words: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And the reason I laid it out in that fashion is, be kind, as I was talking about kinship. That's the kinship part. You can't do that when you're in a panic. And the solution to panic, or the antidote to panic, is faith. And I don't necessarily mean religious faith, but I mean that basic sense that says, we're all right to be who we are, even when we're kind of messed up. The world's right to be what it is, even when it's kind of messed up, even when it's painful, even when we can't understand it. There's some rightness in there. Religious folks would be saying, well, that means God is good, right? And I'm saying, yeah. Basically, that's what I'm saying.
God is good. The universe is kind.
Yeah, the universe is kind, even though it's also really painful sometimes. And we can't possibly understand all of the ramifications of that because we're in the middle of it. But the folks who manifest faith are the ones who can face those hard conversations. So the challenge you have presented to your wife has been for her to learn to tolerate that anxiety of maybe rocking the boat a little. You've effectively not only modeled, but presumably invited her to say, hey, if you're upset, I actually want to hear it, even though it may be a little scary.
In the last 16 years, she has really progressed to the point where sometimes I'm wanting her to go back to the way it was.
Be careful what you wish for, right? Yes.
I'm just kidding. No. I love it. Every time she tells me something that's bothering her, I applaud her. I'm like, this is amazing. Yeah. Like, thank you for speaking about it. Like, putting it into words.
Yeah. But it takes courage to do that. She had to she did not grow up with that. And she
had to trust that I was going to receive it well. And I love that you brought up faith because faith to me is one of the key aspects to happiness.
Yeah. That's why it's the last word of my 7 words. Be kind, don't panic, and you got to have to count and to get 7 because 7's a better number than 6. It's like
it is. 7's a beautiful number.
I mean, I'm Jewish, and it's all about the Sabbath, and it's all about 7. 7's a thing. I guess not just for Jews, but for Jews, Christians, whatever. 7's a thing. So I be kind, don't panic, and have faith. It's that order because it's faith that lets you not panic, and that's how you can actually get through the hard stuff.
And so symbiotic or coincidental, the first core value of the O'Neill family is be kind.
There you go.
And it's the main core value in the company that I run, the real estate company, is kindness. And so there's a lot of reasons I was excited to have this conversation with you. I just want to teach my children, just be kind.
Yeah.
If you're a kind human being, I have 4 kids, if the 4 kids lead with kindness, and it doesn't matter what else happens for me. Doesn't matter if they have enormous financial success or whatever. If they have the marriage that is successful or not, if they're kind human beings, I will see my job as a parent as a successful job.
Yeah, I love that. Kindness, of course, does not imply being a doormat.
No.
In fact, often quite the opposite. Kindness includes kindness to yourself.
Right.
That's I can kind of segue from that into what I talk about when I talk about forgiveness, because in a sense, forgiveness is getting back to that sense of faith and kindness. And because when you've been betrayed, when that has been shaken, it is very difficult to be in that state. And when I talk about, how you forgive, I talk about 3 steps. And, of course, I have to comment, by the way, on the subtitle of that book you mentioned, the one where the subtitle is Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong. I do mention in one of the latter chapters of that book, that happens to apply to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong also. Now, what do I mean? That's a bit ridiculous when I've just invited somebody to read my book, right? Yeah. I'm not saying my ideas are not worth reading. No, I think they are worth reading. That's why I wrote the book. I'm saying if I claim to know rather than simply say, this is my experience, if I sit with people and imply or worse claim that I know better than they do how they should live their lives, that's baloney.
Oh, it's beautiful. Let's talk about sex.
Indeed. Happy to do it.
What role does sex play in helping a couple that has had a betrayal to get over that betrayal?
I'm going to sound a little like Mr. Spock, from Star Trek. Fascinating. It's fascinating. I don't mean to sound unempathic, but it is fascinating how it plays out. Very often when there's been cheating, which is we usually use the term cheating to refer to sexual infidelity. And the vast majority of couples I work with, even now, their deal is indeed sexual monogamy. The intent is, no, you don't have sex with anybody else. These days, it's a little difficult to define what cheating is. I mean, obviously, if somebody is like literally physically having sex with someone else, that's cheating.
Then there's pornography,
there's
right?
pornography. And then there's all sorts of gradations of, well, is it okay to look at porn, but not okay to interact with somebody online? There's all these variations that never used to exist.
Because now there's these, like, I guess you could be, interacting with someone over the computer.
Yeah, exactly.
I would think that's pretty much cheating.
For many people, that's where the line is. But as many people as I've met, there's probably that many different lines. It's fascinating, and they shift. People's attitudes will shift over time. It's fascinating. But given that, let's say there's been sexual infidelity, and it's amazing how often what happens to that couple once the person, whoever it is, discovers that happened, they will not always, but often start having a whole lot of sex that they weren't having for a long time, which is really surprising. It's almost, it's the kind of thing, it's like the offended partner wants to establish their territory again on some level. So it's interesting how that plays out. Often, of course, it's the other way around. Often it's like, oh my God, the thought of being sexual with someone who's cheated can feel so unholy. It can just feel like I can't even imagine it. That sense of, I can't imagine being intimate physically with somebody who's cheated. That's often the case as well. So it's really painful. Sex is fascinating because it's funny. You talked earlier about, correlation versus causation. And my career, incidentally, before I was a psychologist, actually, I got a master's degree in statistics. I was a statistician for a while, and then I got into the psychology and clinical work. But I know all about that sense of correlation versus causation. Sex is often pretty well correlated with how a couple is doing intimately more generally. It's not perfectly correlated, but it's pretty well correlated. If a couple's sex life is good, almost always that means they're doing pretty well in the intimacy department more generally. I just mean they're more able to be honest with each other, and
Yeah, and so then if the sex life is barren,
yes, it is.
Maybe that's a sign that there's some underlying relationship issues.
It usually, unless of course there's like medical issues, which can happen as well. Mm-hmm. But if it's if it's not some sort of obvious medical issue, usually that's indicative of intimacy issues more generally.
But it just seems like such a small number that only 1 in 10 or 2 in 10 relationships have got this great sex life, this great passion, and this great love for each other. Yeah. Why is it so small?
So, of course, I'm sure there's many ways of answering that. Esther Perel writes about that sort of phenomenon in Mating in Captivity, was her first book. I've written about it as well. Where I write about it is from that standpoint I was mentioning earlier about stability and intimacy. And generally speaking, over the course of a relationship, when people do these bizarre things like fall in love and then actually marry someone and then do this ridiculous thing of having children, that phenomenon of doing all of that stuff, stability becomes super important for very good reason. What do you want to provide your children? A really nice, solid base. My God, you did not have it as a kid. And so I'm guessing you prize it a lot. Your wife had it probably to the exclusion of intimacy in some ways. But stability, again, when I talk about stability and intimacy, I call them both needs. They're both important. If they're not sufficiently fulfilled, something feels very off. The issue most of the folks come to me with is
the stability was that largest group.
Yes, precisely.
The group that had the love, that respected each other, but didn't have the intimacy.
Yes, because intimacy requires. That's the interesting thing. The skills you need for intimacy are more or less the opposite of the skills you need for stability. The skills you need for stability are about avoiding or minimizing anxiety. So don't bring up stuff if it's going to rock the boat. Don't talk about fantasies you have that might freak out your partner or yourself. And that, of course, in the sexual domain, that is often the case. For God's sake, don't talk about your sex life in ways, what if you reveal to your partner you've had these fantasies and you think they're really bizarre or really unpolitically correct or whatever they would be, and you're worried your partner is going to think you're, some kind of pervert or something. And you'd be amazed the numbers of people who are scared to even think about their own fantasies. Fantasy life is really fascinating. It turns out to be really important in to have a lively sex life. So the reason so many stable couples, well, that was the subtitle of my first book, actually. My first book was called Reigniting the Spark, Why Stable Couples Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back. Well, how they lose intimacy is precisely because they prize stability. So they avoid anxiety. The chief skill of intimacy is tolerating anxiety rather than avoiding it. As you have described in your own marriage, it's like, yeah, your wife, well, both of you really have had to learn how to go ahead into those places where she's upset about something, but doesn't even want to know it herself, but clearly is. That requires tolerating anxiety. And you said it took some time early on in your relationship for her to gain confidence because maybe you weren't a number one grade in how you received it. Because
I wasn't.
I believe I'll look it up.
I was bad at it. She'd bring it up,
yeah.
and then I would blow
up. Of course.
Right?
I think you're a human being. Is that correct?
I am.
I'll check my notes, but I believe you're a human being. Yeah. I mean, that's, of course. I mean, nobody's perfect at that. And we need that skill, we need the quote unquote skill of being a jerk on occasion too, so it's all part of the human package, so that's why people will often sacrifice the things that lead to intimacy in the interest of stability. And then there they are feeling like, well, there's this fine person I'm married to and we get along fine. And we run the business, so to speak, fine. We manage the kids and manage the house and all that stuff and make our livings and all that stuff. And who the heck is this person intimately? They don't even go there. And that's the point I make about that, of course, and this is why people are showing up in my office. That turns out to be, of all things, destabilizing. It becomes painful. We need intimacy as much as we need stability.
Then it ruins stability because all of a sudden now we don't have this great sex life.
Right.
And then we could veer.
Yeah.
And then we could have the betrayal because our needs aren't being met at home. And we're craving intimacy. And I've heard this a lot, that people who cheat are not necessarily cheating from a purely sexually driven reason, but more from an intimacy driven reason.
Very much. Yeah. Like everything else, it's not everybody. There are people actually who are very happy with their relationships and will nevertheless cheat. It's a relatively smaller percentage, I think, but absolutely what you're saying. The lack of intimacy itself is painful. It's a need that's not fulfilled. My favorite metaphor, and that's usually how I end my little lecture on stability and intimacy when I'm talking with couples. My favorite metaphor about stability and intimacy, if you think about a plant, a seed gets planted in fertile soil, it germinates, it sprouts, does its thing. Somebody comes along and paves a sidewalk over it. Well, roots, the stability is the roots. Roots provide stability so it doesn't just blow over in the breezes. But intimacy is the energy for growth. That plant is going to try and grow because living organisms, and a couple, just like a plant and just like a human being, is a living organism. It's going to want to grow. And if that gets compromised by, metaphorically paving a sidewalk, what will that plant try to do? It'll try and crack the sidewalk. Very often what brings people into couples therapy, for example, a betrayal, it's somebody cracking the sidewalk, or the couple itself trying to crack the sidewalk. And that, sort of leaping to the end of all the work there, when a couple has healed, that's when they'll often express gratitude for the struggle. What you started off with in our conversation today, talking about that idea that how can it be true that a betrayal leads to people being happier than they were? Never heard anybody say, hey, thanks for cheating. Yeah, that was great. Never heard that. I have heard lots of people in various ways say, thanks for precipitating a crisis, which apparently we needed, because look how much better off we are now.
Now we're communicating, we're loving each other, we're giving each other the intimacy that we need, we've become a better couple because the crisis forced us to either leave or grow.
Yes.
So let's just talk about the person listening who perhaps has been betrayed. If they found out that they've been betrayed, what is the first thing you would have them do?
The first thing I would have them do is just they already know this. They're going to need to address their essential panic at that point. They're going to need to take care of themselves carefully. Whatever they can do that isn't about just freaking out. If they can reach out to friends, if they can reach out to anything they can do that will have the effect of giving them some safe space. Because typically what's happened when people discover betrayal, betrayal, it's a big word, for good reason. Betrayal doesn't just mean somebody annoyed you. Betrayal is like somebody utterly shocked you in doing something you never would have thought someone with that relationship to you would do. You can't be betrayed by someone you don't have expectations of. And we always have expectations of people in important relationships. So if you've been betrayed, you are shaken to the core and you need to initially, take care of yourself. And when you can, that's really all about stability. Address your own stability at that point. And to the extent that you can do that, then you have at least the possibility of trying to figure out, okay, how can you heal from this? And healing involves that sense of forgiveness. First of all, you got to get yourself safe. If you're not, if you're in an unsafe situation, you need to find a way of getting safe. If the nature of the betrayal was something that actually leaves you either physically unsafe or maybe even financially unsafe, or, it's almost certainly going to leave you emotionally unsafe. That's a different issue, but you need to get yourself as safe as you can. And then you can actually start to address, all right, what am I going to do about this? And that's where the concept of forgiveness arises.
And they could get your books.
Yes.
And I'm sure that we can find those on Amazon, because I've seen all 3 of your books on Amazon. And they could reach out to a professional.
Yes.
And anytime I'm grappling with anything big, I am a huge advocate of hiring experts. Mm-hmm. So if somebody wanted to work with you, how would they get in touch?
If they go to my website, which is brucechalmer.com, they will see all the information there about, I can offer coaching services in the states that I'm only licensed as a psychologist in Vermont and Florida, but other places I can offer coaching services. And they're welcome to get in touch with me that way. And of course, there's lots of other folks doing this as well.
Bruce, you're a treasure. I'm sure you've saved so many relationships, so many marriages, and help some people find that maybe the relationship isn't one that needed to continue. So the impact you've made in 30 years of helping couples is probably unfathomable.
Well, thank you for that. I really I appreciate that. And thank you for the work you're doing as well.
Well, I appreciate you being here, and we'll talk to you later. That was a powerful reframe on the best marriage advice that we can get from a 30-year therapist vet, Dr. Bruce Chalmer. Here's a few things that we learned today. 1, betrayal can lead to a breakthrough. In fact, betrayal could be the best thing that happened to your marriage. Not that we ever want to go through it, but it could be the catalyst that starts us talking and communicating again. 2, forgiveness doesn't mean that you have to be stupid. Forgiveness is an inside job. What forgiveness is something that we actually give ourselves as we give it to someone else. It sets us free from the bondage of hate and revenge. 3, communication isn't the cure for a marriage that isn't working. Communication is more like a correlation of what great marriages already have. If your marriage is suffering, or if your intimate relationship is suffering, it's not a communication problem. It is actually a happiness problem. How well do you communicate with your partner? How great do you see them? Do you see them in the best light? Do you want the best for them? Do you have respect for them? These are the underlying issues that lead to the communication breakdowns. Number 4, stability can suffocate the passion, the romance, and the sexual drive in your relationship. So if we want a great marriage, we need to have both stability and intimacy, and we can achieve both. And number 5, faith is the antidote to panic. When we feel like we want to panic, having faith that God is good, that the universe is good, that our partner is good, that's what's actually going to give us the permission to have that intimacy that will take us to the next level in our relationships. So here's a question I want to leave you with this week. If you trusted that love could grow again after betrayal, how would that change the way you show up in your relationships? Hope you loved this episode as much as I loved it. And if you love the Good Mood Revolution, be sure to hit subscribe so you get happiness every single week. We'll see you next week.